Welcome back, everyone. I have not one, but two special guests with us today, Roy Tiefer and Ale Perri. I'm going to try to get through all of these achievements that I have listed in a small amount of time. So let's see. Ale was third at Nats, Ivy Street and Blake round robin champion, and Apple Valley and Millard North champion in PF. Roy in PF broke the bid record for TOC Gold bids, won Harvard, Stanford, Glenbrooks, Emory, Blake, and a handful of round robins as well. Then both of them started doing APDA and a little bit of BP in college at Chicago, where Ale was Team of the Year twice, so number one ranked partnership twice. Currently is number one ranked individually. Was the champion of Yale IV in BP and also a two times Worlds Octa finalist. Roy in APDA was first ranked individually as the Speaker of the Year, twice ranked number one as the Team of the Year, and also was Nats champion and also a World's Octa finalist. There's honestly too many things to mention, and this is only part of the story. It is safe to say they're very, very good debaters, very accomplished at all sorts of different debate events, including PF, APDA, and BP, among others. So my first question for you. Thank you for being on the channel today. First question, what is your story? You have done so much in debate. How did you get here? How did you get into debate in the first place? And what has your experience been like?
I can start, yeah. Originally, I didn't want to do debate. So the way that Blake does debate is that it's a class rather than I should say I went to Blake and it's a class rather than like a extracurricular activity. So you have to take a class and it's considered an art. So I played violin until ninth grade, and for a scheduling conflict, I couldn't take violin anymore. And so I'm like, take debate. Sure, why not? I was not very enthused about the prospect. But I happened to be in a program that gave me a lot and coached me a lot and taught me a lot about what it meant to both excel at debate, but also find some joy out of the activity and learn something from it. And from there on out, it just kept going. And obviously, there's been times where I've been burnt out and I've been annoyed at debate. And I was pretty convinced after high school that I was never going to do debate again. But then I went to an info session at Chicago, and then the same thing happened again. So it's kind of like a moth to a flame type thing. But yeah, I mean that's the short version, I suppose.
Yeah, I didn't join as a freshman in high school either. Well, I guess he did, but I didn't initially. I was playing a lot of League of Legends, and that was all I really cared about. I had a teacher named Mr. Gallagher, very smart guy, very nice guy. He ran the debate team, and he had me sub for a guy who was not able to attend a particular local tournament. I was like, yeah, this is cool enough. And then I had a friend named Eli Glickman, whose father had done policy debate in the 1970s. No, that's I don't know if that's too old or too
I think
young.
that's too old. I think that's too old.
My dad was in high school in like the 1970s, but I don't think Eli's dad was, but 80s, you know. And he told me and Eli about national circuit debate because we were Montgomery County debate league kids. And we were like, okay, well, we'll do this. And the school was like, no, you won't. And we were like, well, we'll pay for it. And then we paid for it. And we competed in person, like two tournaments at the end of my sophomore year. So we started kind of February, March then. And then we were like, oh shit, this is kind of cool, and committed.
Nice. And all of its history from there. So ever since you, I guess, both started getting addicted, the moth to a flame, you've started winning quite a lot. So my next question is like, what is your secret? What made the biggest difference? I think in a lot of debaters' careers, there's like maybe a period of time where they feel themselves getting much better very quickly. Was there a period like that for you? And if so, like what made the difference there?
Hmm. That's a good question. I agree that there is a kind of a turning point, I think, in most people's career, but it would be hard for me to isolate a thing that turned that point, if that makes sense. My sophomore year, I spent of high school, I spent a lot of time going to tournaments and a lot of effort in prepping and working, and probably I did get a lot better. But if you were to check the results page, you would not see it, right? So you spend this year just kind of like on the treadmill. And then I got into my junior year and things just kind of like started coming together. And I don't really know if I changed anything, but something just became a lot more fluid. What I would say in terms of what has helped me a little bit is that one of, I think, the biggest things that a lot of debaters sort of like instinctually struggle with is just like if your opponent says something about your case in PF, how do you respond? Like people take a bunch of prep before rebuttal because they really like have to prep all these really long frontline docs, and you think they're their block files the way that some people prep these kinds of things, and they're very, very worried about all these things. And to some extent, I never really felt like that was a super useful way of doing things because I felt like if you knew your arguments well enough, the responses would just kind of like naturally come to you. And if there was some kind of response that was so brutal that like you could never respond to it at all, that was probably a reason to switch your argument. So at least in my view, what helped me was thinking about, okay, what is kind of like the general set of things one could say about this? And not even writing everything out or like spending a ton of time prepping or whatnot, but just trusting myself to know that when I stepped into a round and people said things, I'd probably be able to say something back and it would probably be fine. And then the back half would happen and we would win or lose. But that at the very least, there was not this like fear of a silver bullet argument that would beat me. I was very scared of that my sophomore year. And my junior year, I kind of realized that probably wasn't that important.
Makes sense, makes sense. What about you, Roy?
I've found that the people in any format that are very good at debate, be it PF or BP or APDA or whatever, are those who think about debate from a strategy perspective. They think about the game and its rules and what it rewards and what it doesn't reward, and they're constantly evaluating whether certain things would be good to do in rounds or bad to do in rounds, not at like a in particular this argument or that argument standpoint, but are these good ways of being in the activity? And I think that the way I got into doing that myself was by losing and being really mad that I lost. So when I was a junior, which was my first real year of varsity PF, I got really, really brutally embarrassed in quarters of Sunbite, which was the furthest I'd ever broken. I had a bunch of silver bids and no golds. Not even a bunch. I had like a silver bid and no golds. I had just been losing and losing and losing. And Kevin Zhang and Carter Teagan, who were this team from my hometown, they went to Wooten, which is a public school, a couple blocks from mine. They like panhandled us. It was really ugly.
I've been there.
And
Yeah, did
yeah,
the same thing to us.
and I was like, well, why? One of the answers was they responded very well to all of the things we said in second rebuttal. And why is that good? Why is it strategic to do that in second rebuttal as opposed to responding in summary? Whatever. And there are a million strategic decisions, what kinds of case you run, how good your evidence ethics are, what's the trade-off there, yada, yada, yada. And I just started thinking through them and I got interested in thinking through them and I got addicted to thinking through them as opposed to thinking about individual arguments. And then eventually, yeah, thinking about individual arguments. But I think meta level strategy is the what distinguishes the strong from the weak in debate. And in BP, it was like the first tournament we had in BP, every round after every round. Why was the decision the way it was? What was rewarded? What was not rewarded? It had become just the means of engaging in debate was to think about the rules of the game, such that you have a universal language with which to understand whatever it is you're doing. New topic, new subject, new format. And I think that helps.
Yeah, I think that is such good advice from both of you. I guess like if I were to synthesize it real quick, it seems like what you're both saying is something I found very true myself as well, which is like so many PFers when they think about how to get better, they just think about prepping more or like getting
Yeah.
more into a topic. And I have this problem with coaching as well. Like I've coached so many students and they only want me to talk about one topic at a time. Like no one, I don't know, the views on my strategy videos are always lower than the views on my topic videos. And I was thinking, like, why? Like, it seems so much less helpful in the grand scheme of your development in debate to think only of, like, to invest all of your time into
Yeah.
prepping the strategy of one topic at a time. Like, sure, I guess over time you practice understanding how these topics work. But if you don't focus more on, like, the meta, like, all of the strategic considerations of how debate works in general as a game, then I think that you lose out on a lot of long-term development that can maybe not make you win very quickly originally. Like we all have a slump for a little while we're getting better, but we don't really see it. But certainly pays off at the end. So yeah, I think that's great advice. My next question for you, this is a bit of a fun one. Um, Given some of this, what do you think would be your advice for your former self? Any time, like maybe your former self in high school, the self that was just starting debate for the first time, or at a point that was like a low point in your debate career where you're very burned out or something. What is your advice now that you're older and wiser?
Hmm.
I'll go first. Um, my advice would be that the investment pays off. And the reason for that is getting good at debate faster wouldn't have helped me. It wouldn't have mattered. I mean, arguably in PF, being good at debate while it was still in person and not online would have been good for me socially. I would have like interacted with other human beings and developed social skills as an earlier person, as opposed to getting to first year of college and like not knowing how to talk to human beings. But that's a little more idiosyncratic than cross applicable. But getting better faster or getting more better or whatever, none of those things would have done anything for me. Being less stressed and enjoying more of the journey would have. And the reasons I was stressed and the reasons I didn't enjoy the journey were because either I was worried I would never be good, or I was worried that being good would not accrue benefits to me commensurate with the amount of effort I'd put in.
Mhm.
And I think that's a reasonable worry. Why is it that being good at debate it doesn't get you scholarships in college? It doesn't necessarily get you jobs. The time trade-off, especially when you're traveling every weekend, et cetera, is obscene. And so, particularly for college people where you've already gotten into a university, so the most visible advantage to doing debate is already gone, it's very hard to justify it to yourself. It's very hard to understand why it is you're doing it. The first job I got was in law, and it was filing, you know, motions, other legal matters. It was a lot of complaints against companies for class actions, things like that. They're very similar to PF cases. Research, identification of a cause of action, impact, it's all there. And if you thought about PF formulaically, strategically, etc., you'll be better at it. The next job I got was at Bridgewater, which is a hedge fund that famously loves debaters. Everyone there, not everyone there, but a significant percentage of people there are debaters. It's a very clear nexus. Uh, yeah, the investment pays off in ways you don't expect it to and in ways you do, and you should stress less. And the ride itself is also valuable.
Mhm. That's I guess I probably want to focus a little bit more on that last part. Like the ride itself is also valuable. Some of you will get great jobs at Bridgewater after being an incredible debater. But I think for a lot of us, it's also like we still need a way to justify the all of the effort that's being spent on playing the game. And it is quite a lot of effort. Like I think sometimes people look at great debaters and it just sort of seems like they just magically get incredibly good like overnight. Um, that's just not how it works. Like anyone who has done debate at a very high level will tell you, like it requires a lot of work that you see, like prep, and a lot of work that you don't see, like just spending time thinking about how debate works or having conversations with people. Um, and yeah, I think Roy, you're spot on. Like it can be difficult to justify all of that. Even if it does net you like a Bridgewater job, I think it can still be difficult justifying it, compared to what else you might be doing with that time. Um, and so I also want to ask both of you, like, how do you justify it? Like, what do you think is the meaning of doing debate? Or what's the value of doing debate? And hopefully also like, what is the value of doing debate that is not instrumental to some other end?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I've thought about this a lot too, given I think at least I am, but I assume Roy is also probably in a pretty reflective mood because we've done as much debate as there is to debate, and we're going to graduate. And I mean, I'm going to go to grad school, but debating from grad school seems like a more socially unacceptable thing for probably good reasons. So I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think a couple of things I guess stand out to me. One of them is sort of instrumental, but I think it's instrumental in a different way, which is that I think debate makes you smarter. And I don't mean this in like a very trivial sense of like, well, you know more about the world, like you know how to public speak, whatever. All that is like true and whatnot. But it's honestly, I feel like there's more efficient ways to do all of that. Like if your way of getting smarter is to just pick like random monthly topics that some NSDA old heads like decided. Like that's like a pretty inefficient way. or doing public speaking, doing an event that rewards like very fast delivery and very clipped paces, and then occasionally really, really slow delivery. I'm not really sure that's what it is either. Um, but I think debate makes you really, really think about how pieces fit with each other and what it means for something to be an argument, or for something to be true, or for something to be well supported. And I will say that maybe this is like a little bit of an old head take, but um, I feel like more long form formats kind of help you see that reality a little bit better. Because I think the analogy of like debate's a game, it's like chess, every argument is a strategic piece, has always made sense to me. But whereas in PF, it can often feel like it's checkers, like every piece is sort of equivalent because like every argument could theoretically win or lose. I think longer form formats where there's more explanation about it to each other argument and there's more time to just like, spend on anything kind of lets you see that it's more like chess, like arguments actually do have different values depending on how they're constructed and how they're made. And that in and of itself, I think was a valuable thing for me to see that I started to see through PF, but that definitely became more apparent in parliamentary debate. So that's I think one sort of pseudo instrumental justification for debate, and the other like non-instrumental justification for debate, and this is like probably depends on the person, but at least for me, I think winning rounds is really fun. Like there's just something incredibly energizing about I don't know why it's debate, and you could do any sport and theoretically win or theoretically lose, but with debate, it's just you and your mind to some extent and the work that you did. Whereas other metrics are sort of more arbitrary, like can I kick a ball better or whatever? What does that say? But if it's just you and your mind and the things you prepped, like I think that at least to me felt sort of affirming when I did win. It didn't feel terrible when I lost, but if hopefully you kind of get over it and you can focus on the good things.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is, by the way, Perry, Ale, what is your advice for your former self as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. Two pieces of advice for myself. So the first is be more clear about what you're good and bad at. I think a lot of the time people focus a lot on am I good in an absolute sense or relative sense, and don't do the decomposition of the different things that they are good and are bad at. And this is because I think we are very conditioned to view ourselves either through rankings or through how we're doing at tournaments, whatever, as sort of like this like one line, and it's a one line trajectory, and it can go up and down, it can fluctuate, but it's one line. And I think that that's not so true. I think there's a lot of different things that go into who we are as debaters, and we can improve one and worsen the other, and all of that, and all that's kind of smoothed over by this sort of generalizing thing. And it all sounds kind of like trivial and reductive, but I genuinely think if I had realized at some point during my PF career that I was way better at giving second rebuttals than first rebuttals, like way better, that I would have been able to, do better. I think I would have been able to target my improvement a lot better. And I think that paying some attention to what parts of you are good and what parts of you need work is something that is probably undervalued. And the second piece of advice, very quickly, is that following what I said earlier, I think debate in a way that helps you get smarter, because that's kind of what you take out of it. Most people who go to Chicago after having done PF, and I assume this is true for most schools, don't keep doing any kind of debate. They do other kinds of things. They do consulting clubs or whatever is going to be cool in the next few years. And they do in those activities, I think that the like gamesy element of PF does not really translate. You don't get to do the same kinds of things you do. You also don't get to read your final focus of a doc or whatever. You kind of have to engage in other kinds of skills. And so I would suggest try out things that might be more transferable or might be more instrumentally valuable, not because you do debate for that thing, but because given that you're not going to debate forever, you might as well learn something along the way. So
I also think that's just like fun. Like you
yeah,
should,
no, I agree. It completely is. I agree.
if you do the same kind of debate for too long, it just like even if you win every time, it gets boring. Like you should do something different.
Yeah.
Um, okay, this is actually a good transition to my next question. You've already kind of started answering it, but PF has changed so much, but there are some things that have not changed. Some things have changed dramatically. The general question here is like, what direction do you want to see PF head in? Or like, what do you think PFers should do differently than what they are currently doing?
Oh, geez.
It's a very broad question, yeah.
Everyone always thinks that like the way it was when at their heyday, or even ever so slightly before their heyday, was like the right way. Like, my instinct in answering this question is just to say relatively fast, but not that fast, pre-speech doc, minimal progressive argumentation, but like some for the most egregious of things, PF. Like the PF of my senior year was the best. It'll never be better, whatever. And in those days, we had this worry, which was not necessarily that a certain breed of argumentation was intrinsically bad, but that there was a mismatch in terms of the PF was not yet ready for that kind of argumentation, and then the judges could not adjudicate it, and so you'd have hyper-polarized rounds where, depending on the judge and or the experience level of the opponent, you would either have rounds that were not remotely educational because the judge just did not evaluate the subset of arguments or the kind of arguments that one team went for, or the opposite, where the judge would never vote down certain sets of arguments, and so kids felt alienated because they felt there was nothing they could do. And so the broad takeaway is I hope PF moves in a direction where rounds feel more competitive and less polarized, where people feel like they know why they lost or why they won, and where every round is sort of a foothold into that meta strategy ponderance we talked about earlier, where it's like, you have a doorway to further evaluation. As for what that looks like concretely, I doubt it's current PF. I know basically nothing about current PF, but it wasn't my PF either necessarily. So, and it certainly wasn't the PF of old, in which persuasion, implicit biases, et cetera, kind of were deterministic factors that are hard to think about. It's hard to be like, yes, I will meta strategize my way out of the fact that that person is 6'7" and was wearing a red tie and therefore they won. Like,
Yeah.
But
Fair enough. I kind of asked a bit of a bad question. There's two questions really packaged in one. One you answered, which is like, how do you wish PF looked? And the other one is, what do you think PFers should do differently themselves?
I
Um,
think they should. I think they should just fucking think about it. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear.
yeah, it's fine.
They the thing about the quantity of arguments in PF from like a type of argument standpoint, like this kind of progressive argument, this kind of stock argument, whatever. The thing about that category proliferating is that it is an ordinarily more complicated game in which there are more thoughts to be had and the value of thinking is greater. Like determining what kind of debater it is you wish to be, what sorts of arguments you wish to make, determining once you've chosen fire or water type, or that you're going to switch between them, how to engage with all the other Pokemon, these generate greater returns now than they ever did. Like when I was a kid, the decisions you made were like, do I go fast or slow? Do I cut cards or no? And there were maybe some other topics like, should I respond to arguments in second rebuttal? But they were trivialities. There wasn't there if you were right or you were wrong, right? You were either horrifically unstrategic or you were right. And now the degree of complexity afforded by the meta is such that things are far less trivial, and therefore the returns to thinking are far greater.
I don't know. I was having a discussion with Roy the other day where we were talking about whether, not about PF, thank God, but about like whether things were aesthetically could be like objectively better or just like subjectively better. So I'll do my best to keep it to things that I think are objective and put aside my subjective distaste for a lot of things in PF. Not that I like know exactly what's going on right now, but at least in the few rounds I judge every year. I think there's a couple of things that I think are very bad trends, irrespective of whether or not you think progressive debate is good broadly or bad broadly. One of them is arguments that try to avoid debating happening. What I mean by that is that there's an increasing trend of arguments that are like, you can't evaluate X argument because it is intrinsically bad or intrinsically violent or whatever. And obviously in certain very extreme cases, like that's obviously true. But reading capitalism is bad is totally fine. Reading capitalism is good is totally fine. Reading capitalism is bad and you cannot suggest that it is good because that is violent or the reverse. I think that PFers have like realized it's like this like Yu-Gi-Oh! Like you could throw the card on the table and the rest of the debate goes away and it's like really awesome. This is terrible. Like the point of debate is that you have to like, say things and answer each other's arguments. And investing all this like personal vitriol into it, like how dare you suggest that? Like, bro, you were neg last round. Like, let's not get on our high horses here, right? I don't mean this in just like like I get getting angry and getting personally invested and whatnot, but what I'm trying to identify here is that there's a subset of argument that is like actively trying to dodge debate that I've seen crop up lately that I think is absolutely abominable. A second line of argument that I think is absolutely abominable, and fortunately, maybe this year is decreasing, although I don't really know, is the IVI. I really don't know who came up with this one, but they have a lot to answer for, I think. I watched debates where there was like two IVIs from each side, and I voted on none of them, which is kind of crazy. There's a good saying that's like independent voting issues are rarely either. Like they're rarely either independent or voting issues. Like they're usually neither of the two. So if you like have some problem with your opponent, which like usually you probably shouldn't, and you should kind of just like debate. But if you do have trouble with your opponent, like read theory, I guess. Not that I'm that enthusiastic about that either. But yeah, don't read an IVI. Like that stuff is terrible. And I think that the natural evolution of a format in which you can proliferate arguments that are 20 seconds in independent voting issues is that you read 20 arguments that are 20 seconds in voting issues because you have 4 minutes of time. And if every one of those arguments can win, like, yeah, that's just over strategic, but that's also terrible. And in terms of advice I would give for PFers, I mean, Roy took the obvious one, but I think one of them is like, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think people are over reliant on the doc. I don't. I use speech talks for rebuttals. Like I was a very evidence-based debater. Like I would write things out. Like it's not like I'm saying show up like Devesh with like paper and like things that you paraphrase and whatnot. Like that's fine, but that's a different stylistic preference. But I mean, people will just like write out all of their final focus word for word on a Word document. And if that works for you, then fine. But I've seen a lot of people who do that, who I'm like, if you had not done that, I think you would have given a better speech. Because there's a degree of adaptability that is given to you by just like looking at your flow and crossing and working off of that. And there's also a degree of like learning how to speak from relatively little that I think is both valuable and good for you as a debater. And I encourage more debaters to try that out because I don't think debaters have gotten stupider. Like it's not like we were doing things that only we could do because we were just that much smarter. No, I think that we had a norm and then their norm happened and then they didn't really change from that norm because it seemed fine and that doing the alternative was scary. But I think if people did go back to that and started trying to just give speeches off their flow and just like work with that, at least some people would find that better. And if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. But it's worth trying out, I think.
Yeah, I think a mix is probably good, and you need to know like when to use each one. There's not like a
Yeah.
right time necessarily, but like, you know, do some introspection with yourself and maybe try out both in different circumstances and see how it actually works out. I think maybe we're too old. I don't know if people get the Devesh reference
Oh,
anymore.
that's a horrifying thought. Wow.
Wow.
Um, yeah, although I did see his Nats finals video recently. It has like 20,000 likes or some crazy number like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he must still be at least, a little bit known. But yeah, I feel like I've also noticed I also am not the most plugged into current day PF, but I've noticed a little bit. People stopped flowing on paper.
Yeah, no. Then
Um,
again, Roy also doesn't flow, so it's I don't know.
no, that's
But
fair. And
yeah, genuinely, I think flowing is probably good. I would say.
that's so fair. I'm realizing now also like in my senior year of APDA, I didn't flow shit. But I feel like in PF certainly like I don't know if I would be able to do PF today very well at all if I didn't flow. Like I feel
Yeah,
like there's something about summary and final focus formulas that seems to require that you have some sense of what's going on. Um that's like an example that it's just crazy to me. Like people are reading summaries off of the doc. Like you
yeah,
should not do that. That seems very unstrategic to me. I mean, I guess it's working, like if there's a selection effect that's producing it, but I don't know. Like I'm skeptical that all of the norms, like okay, there's this sense that people have that all of the norms that currently exist at any given time at the highest level of PF or any debate event they must exist at the highest level because they are selected for, like because they are the most competitively viable norms. But I don't think that's true. Like like I don't think it's I think that there's so many other things going on, other factors
Yeah.
are at play in which strategies actually get used. It's not like we're in like this perfect like I don't know, like perfectly rational economic environment in which like everyone tends toward like the best possible arguments at the top. And so then you can just look at the top and then that's how you learn the best possible arguments. There's so much else that's just not being used, like strategies that are just because of because people just don't, because of norms, because of social
Yeah.
things, that I think are very much worth exploring.
Yeah, I mean, and I think APDA makes this incredibly apparent. Like, there's people who just think about the format in such different ways than us. I remember we had a case on someone, and they were like, "Oh, is this tight call bait?" And I'm like, "What the hell is tight call bait? Why would I ever want you to tight call me? Like, that seems like completely alien to me." But the point is, because different sort of bubbles form and different groups and ideas and whatnot form, people have these like very, ossified ideas. But if you other people might think about things very differently, and people in the past and the future might think about things very differently as well.
And that's worth learning from. I think like I mean part of the point of this lecture series is to do just that. But yeah, I'll get off my high horse for a second. Um, another one, maybe one last question about debate before we get into some questions about the nuclear energy topic. Um, I'm trying to think about the best wording for this question. One version of the question is just like, what are your hottest debate takes? Or just like, what are the most overrated and underrated things in debate, period. It's to some extent you've already exhausted a lot of the thinking on this. But I do want to know, like, pick your brains even a little bit more and see if there's anything more you have to offer us.
Hmm. Let me think.
It might be that the answer is
One
no.
of my one of my hot takes, um, particularly in APDA, non-recurring victory, as in like winning tournaments or rounds or whatever in ways that you cannot repeat on demand or that do not accumulate advantages for you is worthless. And the example I'll give is so many people in modern APDA vie and clamor to go to tournaments with their varsity, with hybrids from other schools who they think are good, and so forth and so on. And they think that by winning, um, a tournament or debating with someone who's like way better than them or whatever, they will net some kind of advantage. And they could be right. It could be true that debating with someone who is better than you will provide you some degree of skill or will help you learn from them and so forth. And that's fine. But when those people are in those partnerships, they don't behave as though their objective is to learn from the better partner and be better in the future. They behave as though their objective is to take advantage of an opportunity to win a tournament, and like maximize their odds, like P of win tourney, as opposed to P of become good debater. And there are so many instances in which people maximize P of win instead of P of become good. And most of the strategies that get selected for, or that we discussed before, maximize your chance of winning in any given moment, or at least you think do, and don't net you advantages in the long run. And Ollie's point about like do formats where you learn things is also true within the format. It's like debate in such a way that you learn things. And people, it is the very constant and common human issue, which is like we refuse to defer gratification. We want to win now, whatever, whatever, whatever. And we end up far worse for it. So many people, and part of the reason why PF has such, or not just PF, but why formats in general are such inefficient markets and have such a dearth of people experimenting, is that replication is an easier and lower cost strategy than diversifying. And it's just like I could get good at PF fast by watching how other people debate and trying to be as much like them as possible for the first 6 months. And I'll cap out. Like my curve will be more logistic with a lower asymptote than it would be if I tried my own fucking thing and tried to become my own person. And so when people engage in debate, they should think less about winning in the near term, and more about winning ubiquitously, more about becoming the kind of person who wins. If you're optimizing for winning in the first place, and if you're optimizing for something else, this doesn't even apply to you. So it's just like be more thoughtful about the ways you're doing things because so many people are burning their time and will at some point get to the end of their career, and whether they've achieved accolades or not, they will be incapable of answering the question we started with, which was, why the fuck did you do it all? I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
so true.
I'll give two hot takes. The first is like a positive one, which is I think formats are incredibly cross-transferable. I think there's a lot of focus on when you go to college debate, like, this kind of format is super different, it doesn't have any evidence or whatever. And all of these things are, I think, very concerning and actually think dissuade a good number of people from going into college debate. And then they never get proven wrong because they don't do it, right? So then it's like, okay, I never saw that I was wrong. And so then I assume that I was right. But I don't think that's true. I think that the core skills of debate are probably the same core skills everywhere. And the time that you spend on debate is spent differently. You don't spend time prepping, you spend time doing other kind of things that improve your skills. But like broadly speaking, debate is debate is debate. And you will find joy in refining your arguments for different formats. I think it's an incredibly exciting thing to do. But you will not have this problem of adaptation unless you like really try your best to not adapt at all. So that's like a positive take. A more specific hot take. I think meta weighing and most of the ways people meta weigh are terrible, like horrible, 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 and are like not good arguments. And I'll give a couple of examples for the sake of what I mean. One of them is people say probability comes first because it's what policymakers use. This is not true. And it's also not clear why it's good. There's like two implicit premises here that are both wrong. The implicit premise one is that policymakers use probability. They use probability as they use other things as well. Like it's more probable that I'm going to walk out of this room at the end of this interview than that, we're going to go to war with Iran. But like consideration two matters more in policymakers' minds than consideration one, because like obviously both things matter, right? And the second, implicit premise is that what policymakers do is good. And like there's like whole suite of arguments is that what they do is bad. And sometimes a team will read both that like, traditional policy is bad and then read arguments that are like, this is what policymakers do and don't see the apparent contradiction in what they're endorsing. But more broadly, there literally just is an normative claim attached to that. Like, I don't know why that matters. So I think that these kinds of extreme and categorical weighting positions just generally aren't super useful. Another example is vote on strength of link first because it minimizes intervention. Again, two premises. Premise one, it reduces intervention. I don't know why. Premise two, intervention is bad. I don't know why. All of these things are just like completely gobbledygooked. And the problem is they get learned by debaters who seem like you learn them from debaters who seem very smart and very technical when they say these things. And some like trendy camp instructor who like doesn't flow and whatnot is like, yeah, man, like meta weighing, bro. And like you like, oh wow, this is like the coolest thing ever. And so then you meta weigh. And sometimes you win debates on it too, because then that like, that first year out then judges you and it's like, yeah, the meta weighing was so awesome. And so then you win and that's fine. And like in these sort of very telegraphic weighing debates, sometimes if their opponent does drop the argument, like you can win the debate on that, but it doesn't make it a good argument, I think what APDA does considerably better than PF is like in-depth comparison of arguments at a meaningful level. To me, the very simple thing with weighing is like, is this weighing argument a compelling reason to prefer one argument over another? That's it. That's what weighing is. And this seems super obvious, but it's true. If you ask yourself at the end of the day, is this a compelling reason for this argument over another? Then it's weighing. If it's not, then you just said something. And you can win the debate on it, but like know that you just said something, I guess.
I'll say two things about this. First, it's really funny that you bring this up in this specific call because the first time I ever heard strength of link meta weighing was from Roy.
Oh no.
We were I think I was watching you actually, Roy, doing a practice round before Nats, before like the charter schools topic, actually, Nats, and you made this argument. It was a weird version. It was like a proto strength of link weighing, where you said like the role of the judge is to vote for a better debater, and better debaters don't drop arguments, and so you should for strength of link. And
Yeah, I was having a good time, but this speaks to something you said earlier, which was like that the good debaters do the thing need not make the thing good. And the problem with one of the many problems with the like efficient market hypothesis of debate is it may be that the reason why debaters are good is because they read good arguments, and it may be that they read bad arguments, but are like if LeBron James did the fucking Kareem Hook thing with the basketball. I don't know if the Kareem Hook thing is good or not, but like I'm trying to give us some kind of ground here. people who have intrinsic abilities or have practiced abilities or whatever and are good at certain debate fundamentals can be horrible at debate strategy or vice versa. When I was a senior, almost every topic, because we would disclose, people would read our arguments. Some of the arguments I wrote were gas. Some of them were fucking horrible. Oh my God. It was abominable. We had this argument, it was called like eco-was. Oh my God. The eco-was argument, I was like, I feel like it's hard to form an alliance like eco-was. Well, first I found a card that said eco-was was like really good. And I was like, wait, this evidence is gas. And then I was like, it must be hard to make an eco-was unless you urbanize. Or maybe it'll be hard to make an eco-was if you do urbanize. I don't know which it is, but I'll find a piece of evidence that says one of them. Obviously, given eco-was exists and they urbanized, it's probably the former. So then I had like the 16 kids I coached find evidence that said need urbanize for eco-was. The closest they got was like not even close. I just wrote 3 reasons I thought it would be true as warrants, and then a piece of the card that said like, this is why after the first cities, then there was eco-was. And it was like, oh, we have an argument now. And so many kids ran the eco-was argument on me. So just because the people at the top are doing the thing does not make the thing good, and vice versa, and so forth and so on. And like, think. Oh, and the other hot take is most good debaters are terrible. And I don't say this to be like, oh my God, I was the greatest. No one was ever. No, I was terrible when I was good for vast, vast swaths of it. And in college, I think high school me was abominable at debate and so forth and so on. And I'm sure sophomore year college me would think senior year college me is bad and vice versa. The thing is, most good debaters are replicators or are not especially thoughtful or found one thing that works just for them and just do it over and over. And eventually the market, though it is not efficient, will price you out. Eventually people will realize what your gimmick is, or the meta will change in such a way that your gimmick, just as a function of the natural processes, becomes less viable, or the judge pool will be different, or whatever else. And you'll lose. And the only hedge against this is to think about it so that in response to the meta changing, you have experience thinking and can create a new strategy or whatever. Like if you take anything from my participation in this interview, it's that if you are not constantly thinking about the meta strategy of debate, every tournament you won means absolutely nothing to me, and you'll never get a job from debate, and your life sucks, basically.
But if you do constantly think about the meta strategy of debate, then Roy is gonna follow all of your tournaments. He's gonna, don't worry.
I'll refer you to any job I may or may not have had. I'll get you a Chipotle burrito.
You're here to hear first. Yeah, I think that's so true. Another example of like the ECOWAS effect that's happening right now, it seems like this has gotten almost out of control. And I know like it's as you said earlier, I think you both said this, like it's easy for us old curmudgeons to always think like, oh, the newest trends are like getting out of control and they're so bad, but my glory days were the best. But this seems like objectively, the objective aesthetic seems to be drifting away from us here, which is that I look at the wiki nowadays at like the top teams, like the teams that are winning all of the Octos bids or whatever. And some of the arguments, and not an insignificant portion, in fact, some entire cases of worth of like 3 contentions or something, there is not a single like argument that has a coherent warrant. Like, I think the problem with ECOWAS, as you mentioned, is you have 3 reasons you thought it might have been true. And then you have one card and you cut one line of the card. It says, well, this happened and then this happened. And like maybe the card even slightly implies that they were related, but not even. Like the claim is not even in the card. The problem today is debaters doing the same thing without the 3 warrants you thought of. It's only the one card that maybe sort of kinda implies there is a causal connection between 2 things. Sometimes it doesn't even say that. Like sometimes I'm looking at these cases and there is not a single card that has a causal claim in it. And it's just like people are highlighting words and pretending that those highlighted words could like eventually become like sort of kind of imply causation. and not even explaining why there would be causation to be found here. And that just seems like the death of debate. Like that's dramatic or whatever, but really, truly, like at this point, you're not even making an argument.
No, I judged this argument. This was my first year out, so I guess it's a while ago now. But I remember the argument. So this is on the legalize all drugs topic, and the argument was about Canada, which okay. The link claim was that if the U.S. began to, do weed, I guess, that Canada, which has a thriving weed market, would be very upset with that. Um, that was also sort of confusing to me. I was like, well, I know they have it legalized, but it's like a little bit unclear to me why Canada would be very upset by us also having weed. But there was some card that said something that was vaguely related to that claim. And then there was some card that said that Canada helped us fight China. And then the impact was like the Uyghur genocide. And then I was like, why is Canada key to this? There was no answer in the case, but I presume that they assumed that, since the other team would spend their time reading stupid turns instead of being like, you haven't read a link, or you haven't read an internal link, or why is any of this true? That they would kind of get away with it. And so then both, I think there's an incentive for like both teams to kind of just like close their eyes and just kind of like throw things out there, because if the burden of proof is low, it helps, I guess, both teams in theory. And so there's much more focus on just throwing out as many offensive arguments, which strategically makes sense, but it's unfortunate for like the truth value or even just like the internal construction of arguments.
That is such a good point. Sorry, go ahead. But then I have something to say about that.
No, you go first. You go first.
I feel like there's this weird collective action problem that is currently happening in PF. Need not be the case, but is like right now in these specific competitive circumstances, there's like an equilibrium that's been reached where Team A and Team B both are stuck in this environment where they can't call each other out because then they would be calling themselves out. And also the judge can't call either one out because it's equivalent.
Yeah.
And so the judge and everyone just has to cover their eyes and pretend that it's not happening. And this doesn't just happen with the construction of like links. It also happens with like impacts. I feel like this happens in policy, for example. Like, it is not true that most policies have a link to extinction. And I don't just mean that like there's not a possibility of extinction. There is a possibility of extinction from anything. My argument is actually that like most of these, even with extinction calculus, even with the Bostrom stuff and everything, like literally the probability of the link approaches zero on most, I think on most topics. And it's very easy to point this out. For example, like if they're reading warming or something, not even the impact scenario, but the internal link scenario does not trigger the impact scenario sufficiently to lead to extinction. For
Right.
example, like there's a card that says you need 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to trigger like a 1 degree Celsius rise in warming. And so then if you just read their evidence, it says, well, you offset 1 billion tons. Okay, quick math, that's like 0.001 degrees Celsius. Clearly, you're not triggering extinction from that, right?
Yeah.
But if you do that, um, then you
You look
sort
at your
of,
impacts.
yeah, exactly. Like there is an incentive for everyone to pretend that extinction is one or zero, and that it's not this weird scalar thing that it actually is, where the probability usually is very quite, close to zero for both sides. And so as a result, like policy and the PF debates that are starting to mimic policy don't really have weighing. They just sort of have like, do I win my argument that leads to extinction or do I not? And maybe mine comes before yours.
Time frame. Yes. They
Yeah,
love
like
that one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that's the extent. But time frame doesn't actually make sense.
No.
I'm gonna
Makes
say
no
it.
sense.
It doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense if you think about impacts as a binary and every impact is extinction, right? Like, okay, yeah, maybe if you guarantee 100% chance of extinction in like 9 days, that's more important than a 100% chance of extinction in 20 years. Fine. But that's not how the world works. That's not how prediction works. That's not how any argument works or any topic works. It only works because all of us are pretending that it works. Um, because there are, I guess, competitive incentives to do this. And then if this lasts for a long enough time, then it's like this monkey problem. I was watching a video today where like there was a psychological experiment. They dumped water on all of the monkeys whenever any one monkey climbs up a ladder to get bananas. And then you start replacing the monkeys. The monkeys will naturally start learning, okay, we should stop each of the other monkeys from climbing up to get the bananas
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
will hurt all of us. But then you start replacing the monkeys with monkeys who have not experienced the water at all. And you replace all of them, like Theseus's ship thing, and they all still start bullying monkeys if they climb up the ladder, even though they don't know why. Even though there's no water anymore, there's no reason to do it. I feel like the same thing is happening in a lot of debate events where like everyone has been closing their eyes for competitive reasons for long enough, including the judges, that it just becomes truth now. It's like like a Baudrillard thing. Like now, how to do debate is now that you have to close your eyes and pretend that this is the right way to do it. And if you don't, then you are wrong within the norms of debate. And everyone in the entire community will agree that that is not how debate works. Even though we've completely like taken multiple steps away from the actual competitive environment in which that was incentivized. And now the only reason it's incentivized is because everyone thinks it's true.
I
That's
think
my rant, yeah.
I think to further the analogy, part of the issue is we could publish this video, as you will, and be like, there is no water atop the ladder, monkey, go climb. And the issue is not only that the monkey will not believe you that there is no water atop the ladder, I'm unclear on whether the monkey knows how to climb ladders anymore. Like, there, debate is hard, and the skill sets involved in doing the things that we are saying to do and not doing the things that we say not to do are hard. And part of it is that it's like part of the reason people have the fucking link evidence that has no warrant and so forth and so on is because it's a lot easier to find someone who says a thing will cause a thing for no fucking reason than it is to find a reasonable warrant that's compelling that would survive me being like, your warrant's bad. And so it's easier, and because both people want to do the easy thing, then they enter into the collective action problem. And eventually we lose not only the ability to call each other out and we socialize each other into thinking this is the only way, but eventually we lose any route back. And we used to think about links. I would be very proud of an argument. Now it is, in terms of replication, it is that people have components to their arguments, and the components are strategic. Like, it's a very trivial observation that including empirics that validate your link claim has been true in the past insulates you against some degree of defense. If the defense isn't good enough, being like, if you were right, it wouldn't have happened in 2017, but it did, is a response that compels some percentage of people. It's so easy to call yourself a good debater by replicating that and including those in your arguments where possible, but you're not thinking too deeply about why it is you've chosen the components that create your Power Rangers Voltron robot. And we used to adjudicate whether links were brilliant, whether it was a good argument or not, on the basis of how true the link was and how beautifully it insulated itself against responses. Like I had this one argument that was about like cyber terrorism, and it was like if you like have no first use, we like disconnect the things from the things, and then they can't be like cyber attacked. That argument could not stand on its own two legs. People would be like, they're air gapped. People would be like, no one is going to do this. People would be like, no one has done this. People would be like, just because we do the NFU thing doesn't mean we actually disconnect them. They'd have a million responses. And to beat those responses, I needed separate pieces of evidence. They are not air gapped. They will disconnect it, and so forth and so on. That argument was fine. I think it was terrible. But I could adjudicate whether that argument was good and or bad by comparing it to another argument and seeing how many responses that I think are reasonable and are damning for the argument can people throw at it. How many more pieces of evidence do I need to beat those responses versus how well does the argument insulate itself? What's the endpoint of the argument in terms of its ability to weigh against other arguments that are common on the meta? There are n dimensions of thought you can put into any given argument that people are not. And you lose that complexity when it's just like, I have a decode, it said a link, hoo. And the other thing, the other hot take I have off this is, I think that the most cockiness is not arrogance. Cockiness, or I don't know.
I feel like it is. Like, that's like a
Hey,
synonym.
whatever. They're probably synonyms. There's a thing we can call it either. Let's call it arrogance, which I think is like defined by the difference between what abilities you have and have justified and have proven to the world, and the degree to which you believe them to be true about yourself, or like how you act. Right? It's like it's a relative question. It's like, who are you and who do you think you are? Right? The largest that gap ever got for me, I think, and the gap is pretty big now too, but the largest it ever got for me was fucking high school PF. I thought I was like the smartest, most incredible person ever because I was reasonably good at high school PF. I was not. And debate is such a game. As Ollie pointed out, it's just you, your brain, and your evidence. It is the sort of game that can make you think on the criterion that are most important in the modern world, like intellect and researchability and so forth, that you are the best because you're intellectually dominating other people and so forth. It is a game that predisposes itself to helping you make arguments to yourself about how intelligent you are. And it's a very risky game to play when you are an idiot. And every high schooler is an idiot. And I was especially an idiot. And people need to fucking recognize that the ability to replicate like the ability to knock the ladder out from the other monkey as soon as it reaches for the water does not make them like King Silverback, you know?
I was gonna say there's still water. Like I was gonna say that as long as judges think that, any argument, no matter how shoddily constructed, will fly. If you spend 4 minutes of your rebuttal reading really smart analytical defense, and your opponent spends 4 minutes reading the stupidest turn known to mankind, you're probably gonna lose, which is like really sad. But I don't know.
No, I don't think that's true.
No, I watched the debate at camp last year in which this happened, where the first rebuttal is like all these arguments. I'm like, yeah, this is just correct. Like these are correct observations and whatnot. But people say so many arguments these days that like you drop one of the things, and then the argument that maybe is really terrible in the second rebuttal becomes sort of decent when a minute is on in the second summary, and then you're like totally screwed, right? So
no, the problem is that the first person was worse at some things than the second person was.
yeah, no, obviously,
The problem is not that the second strategy is more optimized than the first; it's that the second person was better. And
well, I don't know. I think it's tricky because I think most of the ways you can point out something is wrong are defensive, just like naturally speaking. And because there's only so many things you can answer that are link turns, right? Whereas defense can be at more stages of the argument, I guess. And so it's generally speaking the case that if someone is making a rebuttal that is entirely of like incisive, what's wrong with your argument type responses, you're gonna be more defensive. And I think that PF is incredibly offense dominant right now, like to extents that I think were even more than when we were debating, where like people still did read defense occasionally. Like I think these days it's just like a billion framing arguments, and then you can read as many turns and advantages and DAs as you can. And it makes sense because if you don't evaluate anything as like having to clear a certain threshold to be an argument, then obviously you'd want to maximize the amount of offensive arguments you have. So it's just from a strategic perspective, it makes sense. But maybe judges should stop like pouring the water, I guess. That'd be my point.
I guess that was my question. What is to be done about this? Like, Ale, you seem to be somewhat pessimistic about this. Like the environment is it's just the way it is.
I judged a couple of rounds of the round robin in 2023 at the Blake round robin. And I got post-rounded like once or twice, which is not usual. Like I usually don't get post-rounded. It has happened before, but not very frequently. And for the first time, I was like, oh, I can see why this is happening. Like I can see where this occurred because I was like, I thought about this for a second, and it didn't make sense. You didn't say anything that proved your argument was truer than your opponent's counterclaim. You said words, I think, but in my view, like when I think about those words, I don't think that there's like a logical way that they could, be interpreted as doing the thing that you want them to. That's it. And they thought that like that was not the case, I guess. And I'm not saying that everyone should like judge as interventionist as possible because that's obviously also bad. But like I think there's increasingly, and I can understand the instinct, right? I can understand the instinct very well. A notion that being a good judge is to turn your brain off. And I guess I'm here to say that like you can flow and be technical and still have your brain on. And I think that if judges did that a little bit more, there would be considerably less water poured on the monkeys who dare to go get the bananas, I would say.
I feel slightly responsible for part of this offense dominance problem. My favorite thing as a senior in high school was what we like to call turning the turn. Oh, it was a classic. First rebuttal would read a turn. We would not frontline the turn. We would fucking turn the turn. If the turn was unturnable, like the link that the turn had was true, and I couldn't think of any reason, and Eli couldn't think of any reason why the turn could have the other link, we'd turn the fucking impact. And it could have been my impact. It could have been in constructive. It was my argument with my impact. And then they link turned it. And then I turned the impact off the link turn. Things like that do not make any sense. Like if you think about that, that's like incoherent. But like we were of the opinion that turning the turn was fucking awesome. And it was like an expression of intellectual domination. And if you turned the turn, they'd get absolutely mollywopped. And they did, like over and over, people got mollywopped. Or we would put like we'd have like a DA or like a turn. And like it would be a thing. It would be an argument. Like I guess you could vote for it. But like three of its lines would be useless. And then one of its lines would be like this other thing that I was going to use in a different way that would really get you. And so it's like a million little sneaky, tricky whatevers with some offense everywhere was like what we thought was the way to win. Just reading defense and being thoughtful and stuff and being smarter than us would not have made you win. I agree with Ale. But like, that's not what I'm advocating. I'm not advocating that you debate in the platonically good way of debating. I'm not advocating that you find the thoughtful means of victory. And like you become like a nice like what I'm advocating is that you fucking figure out what kind of Pokemon your opponents are and be the opposite kind. It may be the case that their strategy is hyper strategic in such a way as climbing the ladder is the wrong strategy. If you think about it and then you think what would the right strategy be, and the right strategy is picking up the ladder and hitting it with them or with hitting them with it, then do that. I have no position on what the best way of debating is. I think my position is that most of the ways of debating that people do are stupid, and I was very stupid when I debated, and you can find ways to beat them, and they might not be in the archives. You might not be able to find them by replicating debaters of old who are good or other debaters now who are good. You might actually have to come up with them yourself. But like, how else does one become a legend?
Facts.
Facts.
I feel like we're losing the analogy with the monkeys a little bit.
Yeah.
No.
Um, I guess I'll add one hot take here. I don't know when you have to go, Roy. We've kept you here for quite a while. How much time do you have, actually?
I gotta eat dinner too. Yeah. We'll do. Hit me with the hot take, and then I'll go.
Okay. My hot take is I think there is a strategically optimal way to debate in PF that wins against this strategy that people are doing. I know that like Ollie, I think I agree with you that you said like the offense dominant strategy clearly is winning for a reason. There are good reasons to do it in the current environment. If judges will let it slide, then obviously, like if you have a limited amount of time, you should spend all that time giving yourself as many options to win as possible. I think if we like, okay, I think that the root of the difference for me is some debaters in PF are starting to think about maximizing offensive options, and some debaters are still thinking about which offensive options are the best. This is like Roy's checkers versus chess analogy. I think that
Solid.
chess beats checkers. And so I think that even if you have 10 conceded turns or whatever, if I have one argument that can beat all of them with good weighing, and I actually do good weighing, and maybe part of the good weighing is pointing out the better construction of my argument as well and integrating that, then it doesn't matter if you have 20, 30, 40 turns. If I just have one coherent argument that just I've thought very hard about how it like up layers everything else. And I think that is the way to check against some of the things we don't like happening in PF without like having to sacrifice yourself in the process and like go on this mission where you just lose every single round out of protest. Yeah.
If I think that your strategy particularly works if you're second, and it might work if you're first if you're much better than them. But if you're second, it could work, period. And I think people should think about what strategies they should employ as first and what strategies they should employ as second.
That's interesting because I actually have the opposite intuition.
I think if you go up there and you're like, my argument, I've frontlined it successfully, I have won it successfully, it's better constructed, it outweighs everything that they do, I am going to find some piece of shit on the flow. I am going to say my argument prereqs your argument, and therefore all the reasons your argument is important are reasons my argument is important. And the PF judge is going to like,
this is a good point. This is a really good point. PFers need to learn how to beat prereqs and like
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
you call them,
that's true.
link-ins, short circuits, prereqs. Like I control
The
the
link,
internet.
my Lincoln. Oh
Um,
man.
they are so like they are. It is just another kind of weighing that you still have to do. So there's two takes here. One, when people say prereq, what they actually mean is I also have a
Have the
version
same,
or
yeah.
impact. Um, which is not weighing. That is just an observation that they are on a similar playing field. So okay, that's not even enough for them to win if they observe that. Like at best, that means you're equal. But secondly, it is so easy to outweigh that like link in or whatever term we're using by just observing that if they are on the same playing field, well, guess what? I am better on that playing field.
Yeah,
Like I have better access to my impact, which is often true, like almost always true, I would say. If you're the one who made the argument originally, one, it's probably because you were in the position to make the argument more intuitively. It's like it fits on your side better. Your link is like all of them are lined up correctly, right? Like your link is attuned to the impact in such a way that it is very easy for you to get access to it. You have a very intuitive internal link. All of it is well constructed, and it just makes sense on your side of the debate. Whereas it is a reach on their side. Almost every single time, it's some kind of a reach. And so if you just observe that, then you win. Like I have the best
no,
impact.
I
They
agree.
tried to steal it, but they didn't succeed. GG.
Yeah, I remember this one time when it was on the Medicare for All topic, and we had some impact that I think was about sickness, or no, about climate change or something. We're probably reading the election today or some shit. Stupid
Sure.
argument, but whatever.
That was
Um,
mine, baby. That was
and they
mine.
were reading some arguments that were related to health because it was the Medicare for All topic, so that made sense. And they read a prereq that was like, if people, no, 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 I sorry, let me. They had some argument that was like, if climate change happens, people will get sicker or something like that, which is like, yeah, I mean, I guess. Or the other thing people will do, which drives me nuts, is they'll be like, extinction is bad because it also links into structural violence. Like all of the weighing against extinction is not that extinction isn't bad. You're answering a question no one ever asked, right? Like, can you imagine if you're like at a fucking like, the policymakers are sitting in a room and they're like thinking about the issue and person's like, this is going to cause extinction. And the person's like, if we do this thing that like prevents extinction, or in theory maybe, it's going to cause massive amount of structural violence, and the extinction thing won't happen anyway. And then the latter person, and then the first person responds, but if we go extinct, oppressed people will go extinct first. Like, what the hell? Like, that doesn't mean anything. None of the weighing arguments are that extinction isn't bad. Like, it's an answer to a claim that has not been made. But people will vote on this, and it's legitimately not an argument. Like, it's legitimately not an argument. But people don't really like think about it or
Dude,
whatnot. So there was probably three or four rounds I judged where I was like, the argument that extinction hurt marginalized people first did not matter because I did not think that extinction was not sufficiently bad, right? Like it just wasn't a point of contention.
I was coaching a student the other day who won a debate in PF, and we were doing like a redos of like a summary or something, and the student realized during the redos that they didn't have any understanding of what their argument was. Or like their argument didn't really exist. They didn't have any warrant, or it like terminally made no sense, like from construction, not even like because there was a response to it. But they won with the argument. Like,
Hey,
what
it's a
is
judgment
happening
person, right?
here? Uh,
We
but
we
yeah,
used
okay.
we used to put so much effort into making really shitty arguments really good. Like we had this like opioids argument where like the links were gas. Like the link it's like Medicare for All solves the opioid crisis for whatever
Yeah,
reason.
yeah,
All three pieces of link evidence said exactly what we said they said. They were relatively good. We wouldn't solve the opioid crisis, but like we'd probably help. And we were like, ah, fuck, not enough people die of opioid deaths a year for us to outweigh any of the other Medicare for All impacts. Like Dr. Drain's got like way more people than there are opioid addicts. Fuck. And we couldn't think of like, we didn't think it would be compelling to judges to be like, our argument is more true than theirs. Because they would go up in second and be like, no, we're gonna beat your defense. And I'd be like, no, like mine is just like true, like think about it, but it wouldn't work. So instead we were like, you know what the opioid crisis has to do with? Cartels.
yeah.
The Mexican failed state. You know what else has to do with? The Taliban. They make a lot of opioids. Oh my God. We were like cooking. And then we had this other argument on the neg. So making the impact like large enough to make it competitive or whatever and whatever. And we had this other argument on the neg that was like this, like Trump, if he win, it will be really bad for people or whatever. And I found the most gas link evidence ever. It was like so good for reasons entirely unclear to the world. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to run Trump bad on one side and Trump good on the other side. And I'm going to run the same links everywhere. And it's going to be fucking awesome. And I did. And it was fucking hilarious for like 2 weeks. And then because I did it at camp, everyone was like, this is an argument that exists. People thought about it for 8 seconds. And all of a sudden the link evidence wasn't so good anymore. And I wasn't able to win. Trump passes Medicare for all, causing him to win the election, causing like fucking Iran to not get the sanctions relief, which causes war with Saudi Arabia. Like, what the fuck was I doing? So,
How did this relate to opioids?
that was the other side. Opioids was the AF, but I replaced opioids with Trump good.
Right.
Nice. That's a good one.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yes,
Yeah.
Very fun. Okay. Well, I'm glad we're starting to talk about arguments. I think we should start talking about the nuclear energy topic. I don't know about you.
Okay, I will go because I promised to, but I wish you luck, and I'm sure Ale and you will generate some very good argumentation.
For sure. Thank you for being with us, Roy. See you
Of
later.
course. Bye.
Okay, Ale, you and me.
Yes.
Nuclear energy topic. So, topic for April for PF is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. What are your first thoughts about the topic?
Yeah. So, one thing I was taught by my APDA coach, which I take as the most valuable piece of debate advice that I learned in APDA. It's not as applicable in PF, but it's applicable enough to where I want to talk about it, is that everything is always about counterfactuals. Nothing is ever like a unidirectional claim. So this topic, I think, is a perfect example of that, in the sense that the debate, if it's nuclear energy versus renewables, is unbelievably different than if it's nuclear energy versus fossil fuels. And this is like sort of trivial, but I think its implications are a little bit farther reaching than what people might realize, in the sense that like entire swaths of argument either exist and are incredibly persuasive or do not exist and are completely dead in the water on this question. If they sort of ignore this question. And to me, the natural inclination is to say that it will be very, very much in teams' interest to develop exceptionally compelling reasons why their counterfactual is a better description of the world than their opponent's counterfactual. And while I do that, I will do a couple of mini rantings and elucidate my point. One ranting is the like trend of like reading the uniqueness evidence that's more recent by like 2 weeks is not that valuable. Like, I understand, like, we post date, like, yeah, you got him, buddy, like, that's great. But if you're talking about, a long run trend in energy prices, one thing being 2 weeks newer than another thing is like sort of irrelevant. And it's much less about that and much more about, whose card is actually right. And I think in PF, there's sort of a presumption that it's easier to like say that your card, matters more than that your card is better than your opponent's, because like we all kind of live in this world where we cut cards from shitty places and we say they're good, and we all kind of just like live with that, which is fine. But I would suggest that you think more robustly about what determines oil versus renewable, what determines the relative pricing, so it determines the political environment, what determines what people buy, whether one or the other. What are the most important determinants? Why are they the most important determinants? And then find some evidence that speaks to those determinants and explain that regardless of what your opponent says, the most important thing is this, and we have the card that talks about this, and whatever the fuck can be true for this week, but that ultimately you have the correct foundation on that. So that's the first thing I would say. Yeah.
Real quick on that. This seems
of course.
a bit abstract for me. So you say like determinants of when people will buy oil, for example. What would be like, we haven't researched this or anything, but
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So one determinant obviously is the administration in power. Like, I think a huge like kicker for the YAF is like, yeah, you can say all these renewable arguments, but I'm sorry, but like Trump is just not going to do that. Trump is going to hugely subsidize oil, whatever. And maybe the response is like, well, the Elon Musk wants, renewables or whatnot. I don't know. But the point is like an administration would be one determinant. Another one would be like how volatile something is. If, there's evidence that suggests that, oil's really not volatile because we have a bunch of stabilization mechanisms that we've kind of figured out over like 100 years of dealing with oil versus renewables, very on, very off. Generally speaking, as, power is not the kind of thing you want to be volatile. And so maybe some evidence that says that that's true, that could be a place to look. Price obviously is a huge determinant, right? That's the most obvious one. But all of these things that kind of exist in like a matrix and they all intersect with each other. But being able to understand, what makes up the decision, and then how do I explain why I'm correct on it, more than just like, I have X card, this is Y thing, fine.
Okay,
But
that makes sense.
yeah,
So the
that's what
reason
I
this
would
is
say.
so important is because all the PFers are just going to go find evidence that like fossil fuels rising now or renewables
Yeah,
rising.
exactly. And that's fine, but like it's not the argument, right? You're not actually making the argument. You're making the consequent of the argument. And
Right,
then
right.
you're sort of like, parading it pie like like you're in a masquerade or whatever.
Yeah, you still need warrants for the uniqueness.
Right.
That's what controls who is actually right long term in the round.
Exactly.
Give me
Um,
1 sec. I'm actually going to pause, get a charger, and then come right back now.
yeah, you're good. Yeah. The second thing I would say is that this is a very good topic to sharpen your abilities to compare things. So the concern with the first thing I said was that you kind of just move the card game down by a layer, where now the card game is just finding my card says that volatility is more important, or my card says that prices are most important, or whatever. And that's, I guess, better than the like up down price this week stuff, I suppose. But I think that in the back half, like a lot of it is just going to be like, okay, so why is volatility more important than price? Just like be able to answer that question. And I think there are like plenty of reasons to think that it is, or plenty of reasons to think the opposite is true. And they don't have to be carded. They really don't. Like you can think about these things, and they're things that people think about. And maybe like a shocking insight is that I don't think that the AP journalist who got assigned that beat this week, maybe has all that much more insight than you do. So I encourage you to think about what might make one of those things more important than the other. So that's my spiel on the counterfactual, and that's like my initial thought on the topic.
I have
Um,
yeah, one thing to say about that before we move on, or maybe two things. One is I've noticed, so I've been coaching this topic a little bit. I've noticed that students actually sort of think about the counterfactual on this particular topic in two distinct ways. Some students think about generically what is the most likely energy that is rising or falling now, and then, if this is the energy that is rising, this is the most likely to be replaced. But then there's a second question of like, actually, what is the government going to do with that money? And that's a slightly different
yeah,
question, right? So like one comparative is there's a finite amount of demand for energy. So people will use one type of energy or another. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Maybe it's the private sector, maybe it's the private sector with government investment. But that is sort of a trade-off that exists. So maybe
right.
people use less renewable energy when they use more nuclear energy. And then a second question is, what does the government energy policy look like in the world where we don't invest that money in nuclear energy? And those are two different counterfactuals that you have to analyze.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I've always found that the second brand of argument, i.e., what would the government do otherwise, to be the worse one, because I think the evidence is usually quite bad. And the reason why the evidence is quite bad is actually just a very simple structural problem, which is that no one is writing about that because people don't write for debate. So if it did happen, if the AF did happen, then people might write that you could do better things. But generally speaking, if there's a thing existing in the ether, it's reasonably rare that people will write, if they didn't do this, they would do this thing instead, and here is the net advantage or disadvantages of that.
Right.
And it can happen. If you have that evidence, it's great. But I think a lot of the time, people sort of read this like one link card that says the government has some program that does X thing, and they tag it as the counterfactual is like very definitively X thing, and then this X thing is like really, really better. And then they read some evidence that's from the government about that X thing. And then we all kind of just assume that that's like a real argument. And a lot of the time it isn't. And I also don't think it's terribly strategic a lot of the time because just some scrutiny of that link claim, and
Yeah.
things can go quite downhill quite fast.
The second thing I was going to say about this counterfactual business is I think there's a tendency or like there's an urge that PFers have to think about this as a binary, like either nuclear energy replaces
Yeah.
fuels or it replaces fossil fuels. Like obviously, right, the reality is that it will do both. The extent to which it does one will be bigger than
Right.
the extent to which it does the other one, and there is a lot of room to like push that like the point on the line back or
Yeah,
forth. Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
but it's worth noting that you can't, this is not going to be terminal. Like you can't eliminate the fossil fuel trade-off argument by saying that it's going to be renewables because that's true, but it will still be a little bit fossil fuels at the very least. And actually, it's worth noting that because that could completely change around. Like I
Yeah.
wrote a small part of my topic analysis about this that like if you do the math, like even if it's 95% renewable replacement and we assume that renewables are like twice as clean in life cycle emissions. Even then, if 5% of the energy replaces fossil fuels are just so much more evil than everything else that like there's still like a 10-fold reduction in energy or in carbon emissions per energy produced, which is like ridiculous to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's worth noting that like there should still be weighing between them that accounts for the like counterfactual divide.
No, that makes total sense. Yeah, absolutely. Um, just other thoughts? I mean, I have a couple
Yeah,
of
yeah.
things
I
I
have
could
I have
say,
more.
but
I have directed questions for you. I just didn't know if you.
yeah. No, no, no. I mean that's totally true. I completely agree.
Okay, cool.
And I think like sort of yeah.
Okay, next question for you then. What do you think are the best arguments on both sides?
Ooh. Okay. I don't know, but I will say a couple of things that sort of guide me in certain directions. One thing that I suspect will be a little underdebated, but that I think is quite interesting and potentially an argument for either side, um, is the downstream effects of the US reducing its oil dependence. And I don't mean dependence in the sense of like we use oil for our own things, but that we are no longer reliant on a set of countries, largely in the Middle East, but not entirely these days, to produce oil for us because we have nuclear energy. And obviously, this is also dependent on the claim that like we will do a lot of nuclear and we'll trade off with a decent amount of oil. So, all of that aside, I think these arguments are very interesting. I think there are pretty persuasive arguments that might suggest that this is good and this is bad. The arguments for it being good are that if the US was no longer dependent on Saudi Arabia, for instance, it would have way more ability to do things like rein in Saudi foreign policy. If they no longer had a spigot, they could just like turn off at will. It seems like we would have a lot more leverage than we otherwise would, and that could be a good thing. Similarly, there's also arguments, although these are, I think, probably less persuasive with the goings on. Actually, maybe not. Maybe they're not. That if you have dependence on, this is like the classic like Heritage Foundation sort of like neocon reason to like want to have your own oil or to interview in the Middle East, is that if unstable things happen in the region, it can be quite detrimental to the US as sort of a downstream thing. And so if you are no longer dependent on oil, then the sort of like effects onto the US go down, and that can be good. The flip of this is that I think there is evidence to suggest that if we were to stop buying oil, or at least considerably decrease our buying of oil from states that do nothing else other than sell oil, and especially sell oil to us, given how much we buy, that could be very destabilizing. And I remember I read this term that I read on like 3 different topics that I really enjoyed, which is about like Saudi collapse. And the argument was basically like if the US starts leaving Saudi Arabia as like an ally or as like a buyer of oil or as like a commercial partner, then people will be very, very upset and they'll try to overthrow the government or whatever. Truth value, I have no idea. But the argument that like when we do this, it has important downstream effects on a set of oil producing countries that also happen to be located in an incredibly unstable neighborhood, I think is a worthwhile thing to think about.
Yeah.
A second set of arguments that is worth thinking about is just like the effects of oil prices more broadly. Like as a very certain thing, this would affect oil prices. Obviously, how it does depends on the route, in the sense that it depends on how much the trade-off with oil is, as sort of everything does. Just kind of the point of my first spiel. But oil price spikes could be good or they could be bad, obviously. I think there's very persuasive reasons why they're quite bad for a lot of people. But it's also like reasonable to think that oil price spikes might have some kind of beneficial impact in the longer run. So I would think about like oil pricing arguments more generally. The third thing I'll say, and this is not so much an argument that's good, so much as a way to make arguments good, is that I think a struggle that often happens with topics that are domestic, where the most obvious impact is something very international. So the topic is domestic, but the impact is to climate change, which is
Right.
which is a output made of inputs that are not just this, right? So there's a ton of different inputs, is that you want to figure out a way to make it so that the US doing this has repercussions that aren't just, well, the US does less bad stuff. And there's, I think, a couple of ways to go about that. One way is modeling. There's a lot of arguments that are like other countries follow what the US do, or when the US companies get a ton of money, then they can do other things, whatever. Fine. That's one way to go about it. I think these cards are often pretty bad, but maybe they're good on this topic. I don't know. A second way of going about it is looking for impacts that are not outputs of all of the inputs, but outputs of only the input you're isolating. So things like, regardless of whether or not climate change kills everyone, whatever, but like arguments that are like, well, just like the fact that you have local coal plants or local drilling or whatnot, just like that is bad for its local area and kills people in those areas. Maybe not a super glamorous thing to do, but at the very least, it gets you out of a lot of impact defense. So that's one thing that I would do. And a third thing is just being incredibly good at isolating precisely what your subset does. So people, and I want to point out what this is not. So like people will be like, well, the US is the number one, polluter, which I don't even know if it's true these days, but sure, they'll read some cards to something to that effect. And so then the fact that you take out the number one polluter, it's a really big deal. But it might not be. Like it actually might not be. Like if there's enough other ones that are close enough for the US, like it actually might not be anything at all, right? So if you have link cards or impact cards that are specifically sized to what your input would do, even if you were going for the broader level output, that helps a lot. So those are three, I think, things that can help people on the topic.
That makes sense. Thank you for the insight. Okay, my next question is a fun one. I'm gonna put you in a scenario, okay?
Oh
I
dear.
will give you, Ale, 10,000 US dollars if you are able to beat the TOC champions on this topic after like a few weeks after the tournament, like a week after the tournament. You get one day to prep. You get to pick your side and you get to pick the order. What is your strategy? Like
Okay,
what
I'm
is the
taking
first
second,
thing?
that's for sure.
Okay.
Taking second, that's immediate. Um, have I not prepped the topic at all?
You've not prepped at all. You just heard about this right after the TOC ended. I'm offering it after.
Oh geez. Is there like okay, I guess the premise is that I really want to win. So um all right, so I'm second. I definitely pick second. Um I'm probably, I mean, without having researched at all.
You get a day to prep. You need like you
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But I'm saying like my assessment of the sides. I mean, real world, I probably prefer to be AF. So yeah, sure. Why not? Let's be AF. And hmm. No, actually, screw it. Let's be neg. Let's be neg. So let's be neg. And I'm going to assume that my opponents are going to go for some argument that trades off with oil, because I guess I kind of have to assume that. And I'm probably just going to read a billion reasons why a decrease in US purchasing of oil is really bad. Why this is just like the worst thing that could ever happen. And why it destabilizes a ton of things. Why countries kind of fall apart when we stop doing that. Whatever. If anything, maybe they don't see it coming, honestly. I don't fancy my odds in the scenario, but I guess the broad rule here, if there is to be drawn one from the scenario, is that in this kind of situation, it would be the kind of situation where I would want to minimize the amount of like very core classic topic clashes that I have to win the debate, because I am structurally disadvantaged at doing so by like the premise of the question, and maximize the amount of ways that I could just like get easy outs on something that they probably haven't prepped that much. And given the analytical abilities of even relatively good debaters these days, you know what? Like I feel like we could at least win on one of those arguments. I don't know. That's my take. Yeah.
What is the like okay, so let's say you've got all these oil purchasing decrease sort of impact turns as your arguments. That does mean you have to concede that oil decreases, which opens you up to, I mean, obviously they will have a lot of arguments about like climate change. Maybe they'll have arguments about like the conflicts that happen over oil as a result of our like very greedy demand for it. What is your weighing strategy against these things? Or more specifically, really, I think what is your strategy against the warming advantage? Because I think that's going to be a difficult one for people.
Yeah, no, I mean that's true. I think the general strategy against warming is sort of like to death by a thousand cuts it, which is just like as many defensive arguments that sort of um, suggest that the impact from this specific thing is not very large. So that's like obviously layer one, but that's sort of trivial. I think I am a very strong believer that climate change good arguments are very bad for the format, so I wouldn't do that. I used to have this rule. I'm like I think I have a more normative predispositions than most people. I used to have this rule where I would not read impact turns to democracy unless my opponents read three contentions. If they read three contentions, then they had committed the moral transgression. And in that case, all bets were off, right? Like we were in the jungle at this point. And yeah, we were in the Hobbesian state of nature, then yes, I can read democracy bad. But if they had stayed civilized and read two contentions, I would not going to read democracy bad.
I think I
So
voted for you on democracy impact turns at a round robin.
yeah, probably at a round robin. That is, I think. Wait, which round was this?
Might have been Ivy Street round robin. I think you
If
were.
it was it
Um,
against NSU?
yes, it was. Yeah, NSU FR. It would have
Yes, but contentions. So that's what I did.
been.
But yeah. So I mean, I would not probably read climate change good, but I would say that if you were a debater who was of average like predispositions who was in this situation, then yes, I would definitely read climate change good. Like that is fine. And the third thing I would do is just set up a bunch of arguments about why. So time frame is not usually useful, but in this scenario it kind of is. And the reason why is because it would set up a lot. It would take a lot of time for you to sort of set up the transitory costs of like doing nuclear and whatnot and actually trading off with whatever. But the shocks to the purchasing countries actually could be pretty immediate,
Mhm.
in the sense that even if you haven't stopped buying the oil quite yet. The fact that that's on the horizon, that you weren't able to stop it, right? That's still a reason why people get upset with leaders or whatever, whatever. Um, and this matters in that I think there are probably pretty reasonable arguments that like just massive wars or conflagrations, both one, um, make countries more dependent on oil in the interim,
Mhm.
especially for like a pretty even a wider subset of countries than just the US, which would be the weighing to like supplement the Lincoln, I guess. And two, kills a lot more people a lot quicker than climate change does,
Yeah.
especially than the subset of climate change that is isolated by the
Oh,
atom.
that's interesting. So you could still retain some uniqueness. Like, for example, you could still say on our side, oil is gradually decreasing, which doesn't trigger our links, but still solves
Right.
somewhat. And maybe even that means that like our solvency is better because when you try to suddenly reduce oil, then that's when it comes back with a vengeance. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
and so then you like maybe even turn climate change to the link level instead of the impact
Yeah,
level.
you could. You could. Yeah, I mean these are all options, I suppose. But I would have to think more about or at least read whether the argument I'm making has any resemblance to reality. I don't want anyone to think that like, oh, Wally's got like all these cards like it, and I have no idea. Just surmising.
Sure. Well, making sure your argument has semblance to reality is at least more than a lot of PFers do these days.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Um, okay. Last question. This one is actually, I think, interesting. I've talked with some people who, when they start prepping or when they start thinking about a topic, some people start at the end. They start at like the impacts, like what is going to be the best way for me to win in the final focus? What are the best impacts for me to access that are going to give me the best time weighing? And some people start at the very beginning. Like I've talked to people who just ask a lot of questions about how they can generate different links, and then they afterwards they slap on an impact scenario once they think that the link is true. Where do you think you are? I mean, obviously, both approaches should be used and mixed. Where do you think you are along that division, if you think it is a valid division?
Mm.
Um, and and like how would you think about this topic in those terms?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I guess you could say that I'm neither. Um, and I guess there would be two reasons for that. Back in high school, I was someone who Christian Vasquez, who's a Blake assistant coach, would always give a topic lecture. And like we kind of like wouldn't think at all about the topic until he gave a topic lecture because we just like assumed that would be like what we needed. And so I always found that just thinking about the topic as like not so much a thing of like listing out all the arguments, but just like as a thing in the world and what are here's the actors, here's the whatever, and then you kind of just like go from there. And I didn't think about it as like here's the links or versus here's the impacts you can. I guess it's more so. I mean, I guess it's closer to the links, I suppose, but it's a little bit not either. And the way that I would think about it in college, I would not think about either of those things. I would literally just think, what's the counterfactual? And then I would just compare it directly to the counterfactual. That's the way I would op every case in APDA, is just that. Um, but if I had to say which one makes more sense for a topic like this, or I guess generally speaking, I guess impacts would be the wrong word, but I think clashes is the right word. And I think especially in this topic where there is a couple of clashes that determine so much of the rest of the debate, spending time looking for those rather than trying to test out each individual link seems like it would get you better results, at least in the immediate term. Um, there are people who research very differently than me, who I think are very, very good researchers who do the opposite. So one example I think is, I mean, I don't exactly know how Joshua Annabo, I don't know exactly how he goes about researching, but my impression is that it's a much more link type debate. Like he finds an argument that's like, here's a thing that would happen, and then just writes that up from there. And he has a very good sense for them, and he researches a lot. So like you get very, very good at that. And the advantage of that is that you're more likely to be able to find sort of like slightly offbeat things. And that can be, I think especially helpful in PF these days, where the threshold for the link is relatively low. So the fact that it exists is kind of enough to get you somewhere. So in that sense, there is an advantage to doing things like that. But at least my initial intuition, especially on this topic, but also just more broadly, is that thinking about clashes and what sections of the topic are likely to be the most important and the most contestable. That's how I would start.
What do you think the clashes are for this topic?
Right. So I mean, obviously the clash you talked about earlier, which is just the kind of factual question. I think that the second broad clash, pretty obviously, is just a clash of like, does the U.S. decreasing oil affect, or natural gas or whatever, does this affect climate change? That is a clash. And the arguments I talked about earlier, the three things are ways to say that yes, and the ways to say that no are also, I think even more intuitive, and all of that is fine. So that I think is another one. A third clash is just generically speaking, like this is I think the most simplified version of the topic. Like, does nuclear energy work? Does it have massive negative byproducts, etc.? Like, think about that. Seems pretty obvious, but also, I guess, worth thinking about. And the fourth clash, I guess, is what effect does it have when the U.S. stops behaving in this way to the countries for whom that behavior is very important? Mm-hmm. And that's both oil sellers, but also plausibly another set of countries that probably care. And maybe part of these is like the countries that might model after the US. Maybe some of these are countries that might backlash against the US doing something like this. Whatever, right? But there's a subset of countries that presumably is affected by US behavior in this way that could be modified. And so there's a clash that's just like, you know, what happens to those countries and what happens in that scope. And then obviously within each of these clashes, you go and look up links and you try to figure those out, right? Because, you know, you have to at some point. But that's, I guess, the way I would initially divvy up the arguments.
That makes sense. I have one last question and then I'll let you go.
No,
what do you think? Like, if you are just predicting here, I know all the caveats, all the qualifiers. We don't know that much about current state of PF. What would you predict are like the three most popular arguments on both sides at the TOC specifically?
Ooh, wow, I feel like this could probably be like cross check. Like I feel like I could, if I'm wrong on this, I'll be held accountable. So for the AF, like climate change obviously seems fine. I think there will be a lot of AFs that like oil drilling and natural gas drilling is bad. And at least we will stop doing that. And regardless of whether it does or doesn't contribute to climate change, either A, those things do contribute a lot uniquely, and B, those things are intensely bad, especially for indigenous communities that are around those areas. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I see a lot of that happening for the AF as kind of a way to answer the question of like, what does it actually do? And you know what? I believe in it. You know, I think there's a third AF that's like when the U.S. is no longer oil dependent, it can be better at doing a variety of other things. And there's probably internal links about the U.S. Getting better behavior out of its out of its allies. There's probably an F about the US being able to not intervene as much because it doesn't have to protect its interests. Obviously, I'm not saying these are all impacts that are hopefully not just about the US, right? Like they're normative claims, like the US intervention is generically bad. But yeah, I think there's a subset of arguments that is like the US being oil dependent is bad and we should stop that. And that will probably be at least somewhat frequent at the TOC. For the neg, so I think there will be a lot of critiques related to nuclear waste.
Hmm.
I'm thinking like I don't know. I used to be much more into this stuff than I am now. But I remember there was like something about I think it was Yucca Mountain or something, which is like a
Yeah,
nuclear site that the US used. That obviously the nuclear waste was like treated terribly and was very destructive. And I think there will be a huge amount of structural violence framing and stuff like that. I didn't get to talk about set call, which is my least favorite argument in the world during this time, but I suspect some of that will crop up related to this sort of branch.
okay, well,
Um,
okay, now I have to ask you. I feel like this is impossible
yeah,
to. Why is set call your least favorite argument in the world?
because teams are like either so stupid or like so cowardly about how they do it. It's either so you're like, what does giving the land back mean? And they're either like, well, uh the AF is like endorses like indigenous practices. And it's like, well, why did you say give the land back? Like you're doing like this like totally cowardly thing. Which is like fine, right? Like, but that's not what you were saying, right? Or they're like, well, I think it's good to give the land back. And I think the Tuck and Yang article is actually terrible. Like their response to like, well, this would go terribly is like, we don't owe it to settlers to explain how it would go. That just isn't an argument. I'm sorry. Like maybe it's very unwoke of me to say, and maybe you have to cut this from the clip, but that's not an argument, believe it or not. And like, if we were to just like, I guess remove all of the things that the land entails, that would have very dramatic consequences that could be very, very bad. Um, so sat call debates fall into this weird space of either they're nothing or they're everything. And when they're everything, they're too often debated as if they were nothing. And when they're nothing, they're too often debated as if they were everything. And the overall vibe that I get from it is just that like no one really knows what they're doing. I don't think the authors really know what they're doing either, if I'm being completely honest. And the debate never really is very good. So that's my spiel on set call. But I'm sure, I'm like a very, very novice understanding. I like coached, I like helped a team at camp a little bit on a set call argument. So I like have very basic understanding of the literature, but I'm sure there's a bunch of, if there are a bunch of advanced policy debaters watching this, we're like, well, what's this fucking idiot saying? So, you're probably right. I'm probably wrong. The second neg, sorry about the tangent. The second neg I would say is arguments that climate change is good. Like, to be honest, they're becoming increasingly frequent these days. And I think they will probably be somewhat prevalent. Um, the third argument, I forgot to mention a set of arguments that I think is important, which is like politics. I
Mhm.
suspect politics will play into things. I'm not sure if it's AF or neg ground. My lean right now is AF ground.
Oh, really?
Because yeah, because like, okay, so Trump does nuclear energy.
Right.
So do the oil companies start backing Democrats? I guess. I don't think that seems especially likely. And if it does happen, then like, I don't know how good that is. Um, and you know, there's probably some arguments that are like, I'm not sure. There's probably arguments that are like when you do this kind of thing, it makes people more open. It makes even right wingers slightly more open to um, uh, more environmentally conscious candidates or
Yeah,
something.
that makes
I
sense.
don't know. Something to be said for that. Okay. Third nag argument is probably um, yeah. I mean, third argument is obviously the trace off with renewables. Like that just seems like
Yeah,
third neg.
yeah, that makes sense. And then the
Kills
renewables are
kills
better.
renewables totally. Renewables are better. Yeah, that's obviously the third neg.
Why are
I was
renewables
thinking
better?
too
Like,
complicated. Why are renewables better? I mean, the nuclear waste is the reason why. I've really not read enough from the literature to like do a lot of in-depth explanation about why renewables are better. renewables are a more prevalent option in the short in the interim. So investing in a bunch of nuclear energy doesn't work. Nuclear energy gets co-opted by right wingers and tech bros or whatever. It's like seen as a panacea. Nuclear accidents are really, really bad. I can see a bunch of potential ways for this to go. But yeah, I would say renewables trade-off is probably the honestly maybe the stockest neg. So
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think it's interesting. Okay, I think the hottest take that you've given here in this section is like that you think climate change impact turns will be up there in the top three. I'd be interested to
I don't
see.
know if in the top three. I said them in the top three, but that don't hold me to. But I think we'll see it a good amount because I think teams will realize that like there is some. Hopefully, one day it will no longer be over strategic, and maybe this is the topic that gets us to that point. But at least for now, I suspect these kinds of arguments are going to be over strategic and therefore a good amount.
So wait, this is like accelerationism. We need to like maximize climate change impact turns so that they go away because people prep them out.
No, 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 no. I think they're horrible. I think that judges should just like intervene against them. Like that would be my ideal world
I
solution to it. But no, no, but to some extent, yes. Like to some extent, that is something that could happen, which is the value of a climate change impact turn is much higher in a meta where they rarely happen, and therefore people do not have answers, than in the meta where they happen pretty frequently and people do have answers. And the reason why that's truer for this than other arguments is that climate change good is a terrible argument that usually wins by your opponents just not being able to do the like
yeah.
response to nematodes, right? So that I think is something that hopefully can people can move past. But yeah, there might be some interim pain, I suppose.
Yeah, fair. Okay, well, that's everything I have for you. Do you have any last things to say to the audience?
I don't know, just don't take anything I have to say on PF too seriously, but hopefully some of the more like macro strategic things can be of some use. And if you are high school debaters, I encourage you to try out debate in college as well. I feel like I have to spiel it to basically everyone, but even if you're very burned out by high school debate, I think college debate is a space where that the things that burned you out, you can kind of opt into or opt out of in a way that you couldn't for high school as much, which is I think pretty cool. So
Yeah, for sure. I would echo that as well. You should do APDA or any college debate, really.
yeah, I mean APTA over VP, but like do whatever your college picks. Right, like your college probably only has a couple formats, so do whatever strikes your fancy, I suppose.
Okay, thank you so much, Ale. I'm going to end it here, and thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you in the next.
Thanks, Mac. It was a great time.